the third transcendental problem. But this gives rise to a new transcendental problem which can be formulated as follows. How is this critical self-reflection, this concentric direction of theoretical thought toward the self possible, and what is its origin? There can be no doubt that this third problem is also forced on us by the inner intentional structure of the theoretical attitude. This is evident when we remember that theoretical thought itself is bound to the theoretical diversity of the modalities of experience even when it directs its attention to the experience of totality within the horizon of time. This problem is not solved by the distinction between a so-called reflexive and an objective kind of theoretical thought, the first referring back to the thinking subject, while the second focuses upon actual objects. At stake now is not the subject-object relation in human thought, but the antithetic relation in its fundamental transcendental theoretical sense. So long as the so-called thinking subject is locked in the Gegenstand relation, it is not a real concentration point for the theoretical act of thought. Kant himself did not raise this problem because the dogma concerning the autonomy of theoretical thought forced him to eliminate the entire transcendental complex of problems from the theoretical attitude. He believed that one can point to a subjective pole of thought within the logical aspect, the cogito, I think, which is set over against all empirical reality as its necessary correlate of consciousness, and that this subjective pole has to be considered the transcendental logical point of reference for all the synthesizing activity of understanding, including both the so-called a priori and the empirical activities. Kant says that the I think must be able to accompany all my representations in order for them, in all their theoretical diversity, to be my representations. It is a final, subjective logical unity of the experiencing consciousness, which no longer, according to Kant, includes a multiplicity of moments which would themselves require a synthesis. Hence it is an utterly simple unity which can never itself become an object, Gegenstand, of knowledge because every theoretical cognitive act has to proceed from this I think. It is a transcendental thinking subject which Kant also calls the transcendental logical self, and that has to be viewed as a transcendental presupposition of every theoretical synthesis. Kant distinguished it sharply from what he calls the empirical individual ego in space and time. As transcendental logical ego, it is devoid of all individuality. Kant also denies that we can draw essential self-knowledge from this transcendental logical concept of the thinking self, for according to his epistemological view, human knowledge can only relate to the given sense perceptions which are gained from the a priori forms of intuition of space and time, and are ordered by means of transcendental logical categories of thought into an objective empirical reality. Has Kant succeeded in showing an immanent starting point, intrinsic to theoretical thought itself, which meets the demands posed by a genuinely transcendental critique of thought? The answer has to be an emphatic no. Kant's transcendental logical self cannot possibly be a unified center of consciousness above the modal diversity of the horizon of our experience. It encompasses the unsolved problem of the relation between the thinking ego and its logical function of thought, and already as such, it can never be a simple unity without multiplicity. The metaphysical conception of the anima rationalis, the rational soul, as simple substance, a conception Kant rejected in his critique of pure reason as empty speculation, is here simply transposed by him into a transcendental logical unity of apperception, which is equally rooted in mystification. There is not a single simple unity to be found in the logical sphere taken in its transcendental sense. Kant's transcendental subject of thought remains caught in the logical pole of the Gegenstand relation, which according to Kant's own theoretical premise has its counterpole in sensibility, to which it necessarily corresponds. How then, in Kant's own epistemology, can the synthesis between the transcendental logical category and the material of sense experience in space and time proceed from the logical pole of thought? If the logical aspect of thought and the aspect of sense perception cannot be traced back to one another, as he himself emphatically states, then neither can the starting point for the synthesis be found in the former. By accepting as axiomatic that the synthesis proceeds from the transcendental logical subject of thought and is executed in the transcendental faculty of imagination, Kant has left the critical path of research and swept aside the real problem of the process of theoretical synthesis. As a result, the true starting point of his critique of knowledge has remained hidden. Now, if no starting point for the intermodal synthesis can be found in theoretical thought as such, then the concentric direction of this thought which is necessary for critical self-reflection cannot be of a theoretical nature either. It must be rooted in the selfhood as the individual center of human existence. This means that it is not possible to get through to the true starting point of theoretical thought without having arrived at genuine self-knowledge. At least it is not possible without having learned to know the real nature of selfhood as the supramodal center of existence. So the starting point is no longer the so-called structural unity of the theoretical act of thought. For such a structural unity, which remains enclosed within the temporal horizon, can never be more than a unity in the diversity of the modal aspects of time, i.e. an intermodal but not supramodal unity. Such an intermodal unity is no more than a temporal structure which, as such, cannot possess a central point of reference for all its modal aspects. For that reason, the qualification of selfhood as an act center remains a mystification as long as this center continues to be sought within the temporal act sphere itself. If anyone believed he could find the center of existence in a historical temporality, in an anticipatory direction dissociated from all that is a given of experience, he would be forgetting that such a temporality can only be a theoretical abstraction from the integral horizon of time, which also embraces the givens and can only be identified with it by way of an absolutization. Nowhere does universal time as such offer a central point of reference in the sense of a root unity of human existence, one that genuinely transcends the modal coherence of temporal aspects. Yet every absolutization we can uncover in immanence philosophy implies such a radical reference point in terms of which the absolutization is executed. It is proof of a lack of self-knowledge when people suppose they can secure access to the root unity of human existence through an autonomous theoretical metaphysics. The traditional metaphysical concept of being, ignoring now its speculative origins, is an analogical concept which remains caught up in the cosmic spectrum of meaning diversity and cannot as such be a concentration point for the theoretical act of thought. And the metaphysical concept of substance, which is rooted in this notion of being, is not able to give theoretical thought a concentric direction either, since it remains in a state of dispersion in the diversity of the substances adopted. The notion of the substantial simplicity of the rational soul, anima rationalis, adopted by Thomas Aquinas, continues to be burdened by inner contradiction, since the concept of rational soul is only the product of a theoretical abstraction in which there is no space for an absolute unity. Now, the concentration of theoretical thought, itself caught up in the temporal diversity of the modal aspects upon the self, as the root unity both of our horizon of experience and of our temporal existence, is possible only in a simultaneous concentration upon the real, or supposed origin of all that is relative. As long as we try theoretically to grasp the selfhood in itself as a self-enclosed independence, it dissolves into nothing, in the utter negation of all definitions. For the self, as the root unity of our existence, does not exist in itself. It truly transcends all conceptual understanding. It does indeed possess an existent nature, but not in the sense of an anticipatory historical temporality of human existence that is opposed to givens. Rather, this existence has the radical biblical sense of a transcending creaturely image of the absolute origin, namely God, an image which constantly has to reach beyond itself to find both itself and its origin. In other words, the selfhood is the religious center of human existence, which does in fact transcend the modal diversity of the temporal horizon, because by nature it concentrates all that is relative upon the absolute. The utterly central religious domain of consciousness may therefore in no way be confused with one of the modal aspects of the temporal horizon, not with the emotional psychical, nor with the logical, nor with the moral, nor even with the faith aspect. This last aspect, that of faith, is the temporal limiting aspect of this horizon, through which the religious tendency of our selfhood imparts itself to all the modal functions of our experience. But in terms of its modal structure, it remains the faith aspect caught up in the modal diversity and the unbreakable intermodal temporal coherence of aspects. It cannot be the root unity of all the modal functions. Faith itself requires the supramodal point of reference of consciousness, which can only be found in the selfhood. It is I who believe, as it is I who think logically, feel, live, etc. Self-knowledge never occurs in the divergent direction of the temporal diversity of our existence, rather only in the concentric direction, in which the self becomes conscious of the dependency of all that is relative and seeks the expression of the unity of origin in its radical created unity. This means that self-knowledge is dependent on the knowledge of God. Both take shape in the central grip of the absolute, upon the religious center of our existence, not in a supposed autonomous concept which arises from the activity of theoretical thought. Because we are in the grip of the absolute, we learn to know it as an encounter which is at the same time a realization. This knowledge does not occur outside our temporal cognitive functions. It permeates them and gives them a concentric direction. Nevertheless, this knowledge also transcends the temporal horizon of our experience with its modal diversity of aspects. It is central, not functional. The fall into sin has turned this self-knowledge and knowledge of God into an apostate direction and obscured the image of God in the mirror of the self. But the religious nature of the center, or the heart, of human existence has not been lost as a result. Instead, the innate drive of the selfhood to seek its origin now asserts itself in the absolutization of that which is relative, of something in creation. Humankind searches for itself and its origin within the horizon of time. The darkened mirror of the root, radix, of our existence transforms the divine image into idols, false gods, to which the self surrenders in an imagined encounter in which it believes it can find rest. Even those who believe in all sincerity that they have broken with all religion and have no need for it continue to be in the grip of those idols, to which they devote all their energies. Human selfhood by nature points beyond itself. This also implies that the selfhood, although it is, in fact, the individual root unity of the consciousness to which the acts of theoretical thought are necessarily related, still cannot offer within itself the sought-after deepest starting point of theoretical thought. The I is not self-enclosed like a windowless monad. It is only an I in the central communal relation of the we, and in its existent relation to the thou of its divine origin. In the we, the I also steps outside of itself, in order to find itself and its origin in the existence of the human-rooted community. This root community is of a spiritual kind, in the pregnant religious sense of the word, and is only made effective by a community spirit, which, as the central dynamic driving force, gives human existence its final direction in its religious ground motive. Philosophical thought, which operates within the temporal horizon, is no exception. It, too, receives its central direction from this source. Where the I is the hidden player on the instrument of theoretical thought, the central motif of the music proceeds from the community spirit operative in the individual centers of human existence. It is the religious ground motive which determines the sought-after central starting point for the theoretical synthesis. Here the transcendental critique of thought has hit upon the necessary inner connection between religion and philosophy. Since philosophy, through its theoretical total view of the horizon of experience and the empirical reality enclosed within it, gives to science in the narrow sense its necessary presuppositions, we have also penetrated to the inner connection between religion and science. From the inner structure and nature of the theoretical attitude itself, this root-penetrating critique of thought has brought to light the non-self-sufficiency of theoretical thought, i.e., that it is necessarily determined by the central and super-theoretical dunamis of the religious ground motive. If, for the sake of the dogma of autonomy, it were to refuse to account for these super-theoretical presuppositions of philosophical thought, it would cease to be critical and lapse into the theoretical dogmatism which conceals its true starting point. It does not help to try to escape from the transcendental critique of thought by appealing to the universally valid structure of human experience and theoretical thought. That structure is the same for all human beings, but it does call for a central point of reference in the activity of theoretical thought, without which the structure cannot be actualized and which it cannot provide by itself. Meanwhile, even the transcendental critique necessarily finds itself in the grip of a particular central ground motive that gives direction to its own theoretical research. As long as it limited itself to the formulation of the transcendental problems forced upon it by the intentional structure of the theoretical attitude itself, it could have the appearance of proceeding from the same immanent standpoint whose illusory character it had just brought to light. Such a situation may be observed, for example, in the work of Maurice Blondel. He consciously accepted the immanent standpoint as starting point for the purpose of demonstrating its non-self-sufficiency by the method of radically thinking through the implications of the intrinsic totality tendencies of philosophical reflection. Still, this neo-scholastic method cannot possibly lead to a genuine transcendental critique of thought. One who takes this road will not catch sight of the real transcendental problems of the theoretical attitude, because that person is dogmatically proceeding from the possibility of a theoretical autonomy of thought. The philosophy of the cosmonomic idea does appeal to universally valid states of affairs when it conducts an investigation into the intentional structure of the theoretical attitude. At the same time, It makes clear that these states of affairs necessarily remain hidden from the theoretical view as long as the theoretical attitude of thought itself has not become a critical problem. For that reason, its posing of the transcendental problem is controlled from the start by those super-theoretical presuppositions which are not exposed until the final stage of the transcendental critique. Immanence philosophy, on the other hand, continues to conceal its necessary presuppositions behind the dogma of the autonomy of theoretical thought, and yet its formulation of the problems is also determined by a super-theoretical and central starting point. So the question becomes, which central starting point in fact makes possible the radical, transcendental critique of thought itself? Which one frees the theoretical view from presuppositions which block insight into the integral horizon of human experience and its actual central point of reference? And which one, at the same time, reveals and explains such presuppositions in their true character so that the community of philosophical thought is not lost in the necessary confrontation of ground motives. The biblical ground motive. The central starting point which meets these conditions is offered exclusively by the radical and integral ground motive of the Word of God, that of creation, fall, and redemption through Jesus Christ in the fellowship of the Holy Spirit. Footnote: this does not mean that the road towards a transcendental critique is closed to immanence philosophy. In that case, the transcendental criticism would have broken the philosophical community of thought it actually sets out to serve. On the level of theoretic philosophical reflection, the philosophy of the cosmonomic idea constantly makes an appeal to universally valid structural states of affairs that would only remain hidden as long as the theoretical attitude of thought itself is not considered critically. That immanence philosophy by itself cannot manage to break through its own dogmatic standpoint does not demonstrate that it cannot, along the lines of our transcendental critique, be brought to a critical self-reflection upon its own central starting point. It only precludes, insofar as its adherents consciously reject the biblical ground motive, that they could ever come to radical self-knowledge, revealing the apostate meaning of their central starting point to them. The statement in the text merely wants to emphasize this point. This is indeed the key of knowledge because, in the authentic self-revelation of God, it simultaneously discloses humankind to itself, lays bare the root unity and root community of its existence, and unveils the ground motive of apostasy from God as the source of all absolutization. But precisely because it discloses the utter solidarity of the human race both in creation and in the fall into sin, it can never, as a starting point for philosophical thought, lead to a rupture of the community of philosophical thought. Rather, it puts all philosophical as well as theological reflection equally under its radical critique. This kind of transcendental critique of thought, which is really in the grip of this scriptural starting point, ultimately practices self-criticism when it expresses criticism of immanence philosophy, and it only continues this self-criticism by subjecting also the provisional and positive results of the philosophy of the cosmonomic idea to the critical process. Having disclosed the necessary interconnection between philosophical theoretical thought and the central religious domain of human consciousness, the philosophy of the cosmonomic idea continues on its way by bringing into full view the religious ground motives which controlled Western thought in its development from Greek antiquity. The divergence of these ground motives is only explicable in terms of the apostate direction in which the innate drive toward concentration of human existence begins to manifest itself, i.e., when humankind turns away from the Word of God from which alone it can draw spiritual life, and begins to search for itself and its origin within the temporal horizon with its intrinsic diversity of meaning. In the temporal horizon, the religiously unified meaning of the world that is concentrated in the human selfhood is broken up in a rich diversity of inseparable modalities and individuality structures. This horizon presents numerous possibilities for absolutization and for the formation of idols. The root of all divergence in ground motives is the common spirit of apostasy itself. Its central driving power leads humankind away from its true origin and in its final consequence results in a meaningless nothing. To that extent, the ground motive of apostasy remains one and the same, regardless of the diversity in the modes of its manifestation. The root of these apostate ground motives is not eliminated by the central motive of divine word revelation, but rather is unmasked by it in its true character. For that reason, this last mentioned motive is not just one among several others, but in fact the only integral and radical ground motive which leads us to genuine knowledge of God and of self, and also enables us to really know the human being and the world concentrated in that human being in its state of apostasy. As such, the biblical motive cannot lead to divergence in the starting point of Christian philosophy. When in Christian philosophical thought, such divergencies in starting point nevertheless make their appearance, they can only be explained by the fact that unbiblical ground motives have cropped up in the process, motives which scholars attempted to adapt to the biblical one. In this process, the biblical motive had to be accommodated to such an extent that it lost its radical and integral grip on human thought. Because such religious syntheses sought justification in orthodox or non-orthodox theological scholarship, the transcendental critique of thought has to remind people over and over again that the key of knowledge is not to be found in theological scholarship. The unbiblical ground motives of Western philosophy reveal their true character also in their theological synthesis with the biblical creation motive through their inner dialectic structure. In fact, they consist of two central motives which are bound up in irreconcilable religious conflict and constantly drive philosophical thought that has come under their influence into opposite directions from one pole to the other. This religious dialectic is rooted in the absolutization of the relative, which only has meaning within time in unbreakable coherence of meaning with its own correlates. The absolutization breaks up this coherence in the illusion of an idol without being able actually to cancel it. Hence, every absolutization of a relation calls forth the corresponding relata. These correlata then emerge in religious consciousness as independent counterforces against the dynamics of the first absolutized motive. Since this conflict occurs in the central starting point of philosophical thought, it can never be resolved by a merely theoretical synthesis. Every theoretical synthesis demands a central point of reference which transcends the theoretical antithesis. But a conflict on the level of the ground motive necessarily assumes an absolute character because there is no more basic starting point from which to launch a genuine synthesis. For that reason, a religious synthesis cannot be brought about in reality. It remains an illusion. Only the biblical ground motive shows the way to rise above the religious antithesis. This is not the way of a synthesis with the motive of the fall into sin, but that of real redemption from the power of sin through Jesus Christ, who creates the fellowship of the Holy Spirit. Since Greek antiquity, however, one still finds that attempts have been made in Western philosophy to resolve the radical antithesis in the ground motive by means of a dialectic method of thought, and so to establish a theoretical metaphysical synthesis. Such attempts are uncritical. The moment philosophical thought, caught up in the grip of a dialectic ground motive, begins to undertake critical self-reflection, the metaphysical synthesis dissolves back into the ultimate antithesis of its starting point. As Proudhon wrote, the antinomy does not resolve itself. The religious dialectic of the ground motive tends to drive philosophical thought, when it becomes self-critical, toward a dualistic picture of the human person and the world. In the process, the integral coherence of meaning of the temporal horizon of our experience is broken up into a dichotomy. This is also how the metaphysical oppositions between noumenon and phenomenon, immortal rational souls and material bodies, the is and the ought, etc., arise. Periodically, these oppositions are again thwarted by uncritical monistic conceptual tendencies. Since a genuine resolution of the conflict in the dialectic ground motive is not possible, there is only one critical mode of escape left. It is that of assigning primacy to one of the antithetic motives, a process that is inevitably accompanied by the devaluation of the other. The continual shift back and forth of primacy, the attempts at synthesis, and the critical dissolving of these syntheses back into the original radical antithesis are typical phenomena accompanying the influence of religious dialectic in the domain of philosophical thought. Western dialectic ground motives. The philosophy of the cosmonomic idea has, through its transcendental critique of immanence philosophy, made an extensive study of the process in which Western philosophical thought has been caught up under the influence of these dialectical ground motives. These ground motives are 1. The form-matter motive of Greek philosophy, which permeates all of Greek thought at its roots and governs even its conception of mathematics. 2. The scholastic ground motive of nature and supernatural grace, which, through its attempt to unite the biblical ground motive of creation with that of the Greek form-matter motive, and in modern times with that of the humanistic ground motive, involves Christian thought in a dialectical process and lays the foundation for the modern secularization of philosophy. And 3, the humanistic ground motive of nature and freedom, which completes this secularization and has led, in the most recent dialectic phase of immanence philosophy, to the fundamental crisis of a state of spiritually uprooted thinking. The form-matter motive. The first ground motive, which before Aristotle had no fixed name, originated in the conflict between the younger cultural religion of the Olympic gods and the natural religions of Greek antiquity. However little we know of the very divergent cultic forms of the latter, we do know that the theme of life and death was central, and it was specifically the Dionysian cult imported from Thrace in which this theme found full expression. In this cult, the deity was not represented in any fixed form or figure. It was rather the vital current eternally flowing from the womb of Mother Earth. This vital current was venerated as a formless but material and divine principle of origin. Out of this divine, ancient principle arose generations of mortal beings who sought to be embodied in a fixed form, and were on this account subjected to the wrath of Ananke, the terrifying and unavoidable fate of death. The form is not divine and cannot endure. In the ecstatic cult of Dionysus, this was symbolized by the tearing up of an animal whose flesh was eaten raw. On approaching the god Dionysus, ecstasy led to an intrinsic break with the limitations of the bodily form to the point of immersion in the stream of divine life. The religious ground motive of this vitality cult, that of the divinity of the vital current, and that of Ananke as the avenger of every attempt to bind the vital current to any physical form, exerted a permanent and central influence on Greek thought and art. This is the original Greek motive of matter, which had, as its dialectic counterpart, the motive of form implicit in the younger cultural religion of the Olympic deities. The latter was the religion of form, measure, and harmony. The Olympic gods left Mother Earth behind with its never-ending cycle of beginning and ending of life and death. They were immortal. As deified forces of culture, they took on personal form, which invisibly shared in the quality of imperishability. But these supramundane deities had no power over Ananke, which ruled over the earthly cycle of life and death. For that reason, the Greeks clung to the ancient nature cults in their private lives, while Olympic religion became merely the official religion of the Greek polis. The Orphic cult was a movement of religious reform aimed at a religious synthesis between the Dionysian cult of the vital current and the Olympian cultural religion. The form motive of the latter was diverted, however, in the direction of the Uranian motif of the divine measure and harmony of the starry heavens. It is in this cult that the form-matter motive finds its first anthropological expression in a dualistic view of a person. The immortal, rational soul, which originated in the astral heavens, fell down on the dark earth. On earth it was enclosed in the dungeon of a material body, and thus caught up in the cycle of origination, demise, and reincarnation. The cycle continued until, by an ascetic lifestyle, it had purified itself of the defilement of the earthly body and could again return to its heavenly home. This form-matter motive, born of conflict between the antagonistic religions, was not, as a dialectic religious ground motive, bound to the mythological and ritual forms of popular faith. Over against this faith, Greek philosophy claimed its autonomy, but the religious ground motive of form and matter continued to be its common starting point and determined the entire course of its dialectical development. It controlled its view of nature, physis, its metaphysical doctrine of being, its anthropology, its ethics and philosophical theology, as well as its view of the state and human society. Its dialectical process ran from according primacy to the motive of matter by the Ionian philosophy of nature and Heraclitus' philosophy of life, to giving primacy to the motive of form in cultural religion. In the process, the material principle was reduced to the status of the principle of imperfection, and the divine nous, as pure form, was understood as being divorced from all matter. From the uncritically held monistic conception of the origin, arche, of nature, physis, Greek thought is then driven, by way of Parmenides' rigid theory of being, toward the acceptance of two mutually irreducible principles of origin, Attempts at synthesis by means of a dialectic logic then lead to an analogical metaphysical doctrine of being, which is given its first foundation in Plato's Eleatic dialogues and elaborated in his own way by Aristotle in his Metaphysics. Matter, as being in potentiality, is related to the form of being as the goal toward whose actualization the natural process of becoming strives, genesis is ousion, in Plato's Philebus. The essential form as entelechy of the natural process of becoming in Aristotle. But the analogical concept of being that was intended dialectically to unite the principles of matter and form lacked a central starting point for this synthesis, and therefore, upon critical self-reflection, had to dissolve itself again in the absolute antithesis of the religious ground motive. In Plato's Timaeus, this final antithesis again comes to clear expression, in the polar opposition between the form-giving activity of the divine demiurge and the deviant cause of self-willed ananke. In Aristotle's metaphysics, it comes out in the polar opposition between pure matter and the pure actualized divine form. The nature-grace motive. The scholastic ground motive of nature and supernatural grace originates from the attempt to accommodate the Greek form-matter motive and the radical biblical ground motive to each other. In the scholastic theology of Thomism, it gains its hold on Christian thought. It permeates Roman Catholic Church doctrine, theology, philosophy, and sociology. Reformed Protestant thought also, by and large, continues to be open to the religious influence of the scholastic ground motive. As a result, it soon loses its reforming impulse. The Greek form-matter motive fundamentally excluded the biblical motive of creation. The scholastic accommodation of the Aristotelian view of nature to the church doctrine of creation led to a distinction between a natural and a supernatural sphere, the first being considered a relatively autonomous substructure of the second. The church doctrine held that during creation a supernatural gift of grace was bestowed on human nature, viewed as being composed of an immortal, rational soul as its substantial form and a perishable material body. This supernatural bestowal was lost at the time of the fall, a loss which did not corrupt nature as such. In this system, there was no longer any room for the radical religious unity of human existence. As a result, the creation motive, now accommodated to the Aristotelian view of nature, lost its radical grip on philosophical and theological thought. Nor was there any room left, at least in officially approved Roman Catholic scholasticism, for the radical nature of the fall and redemption of a person. In the meantime, Protestant scholasticism, which also accepted the Aristotelian scholastic view of human nature, came into conflict with that view by retaining the biblical standpoint regarding human nature. In Thomistic scholasticism, the accommodated Aristotelian metaphysics, with its analogical doctrine of being and its culmination in a natural theology, became the relatively autonomous anticipatory stage of the Church's doctrine of supernatural grace. The idea that nature has its primary cause in God as the unmoved mover, together with the Aristotelian proofs for the existence of God, were proclaimed to be a natural truth to be grasped by the natural light of reason. This unmoved mover was equated with the divine creator, although the Aristotelian form-matter motive was intrinsically inconsistent with the notion of the first cause as creating cause. The synthetic conception of Thomas Aquinas assumed and proceeded from a natural harmony between the natural light of reason and the supernatural truths of the Church. The interconnection between the two was located in the natural desire of reason for its supernatural perfection. The autonomy ascribed to natural reason was understood in a scholastic synthetic sense, viz., that reason, because it can only penetrate the truths of nature, can never conflict with the truth of revelation, and that philosophy has a serving function in relation to the theology of revelation. Implicit in this conception, naturally, is the scholastic accommodation of Aristotelian philosophy to church dogma. But the inner dialectic of the nature-grace motive led, in the 14th century, to the dissolution of the Thomistic synthesis into a polar antithesis. The powerful nominalistic movement of later scholasticism, led by William of Ockham, denied every link between natural and supernatural knowledge. Nature and grace took separate paths. Natural intellect was denied every capacity to know things metaphysical, and natural theology was rejected along with metaphysics. The realistic criterion of truth made way for a nominalistic one. Occam still assigned primacy to the sphere of grace. For him, this implied the belittling of natural reason, which therefore had no value whatsoever as a preparatory stage for supernatural knowledge. But toward the end of the Middle Ages, there emerged clear symptoms of a relocation of primacy in the sphere of nature. The first indication of this shift occurred in the secularization of the theory concerning the Church in nominalistic scholasticism, a development which can already be observed in the work of Marsilius of Padua. In this way, the nominalistic movement became the forerunner of humanism. The nature-freedom motive. The humanistic ground motive of nature and freedom implies a complete break with the Christian scholastic motive of supernatural grace. It originates in a Copernican reversal of the biblical image of a person, a radical shift which takes us directly to a religion of human personality in which the entire biblical ground motive is humanized. The movement of the Italian Renaissance is in fact energized and directed by the religious motive of a Rinascimento, in which one is reborn to be an utterly autonomous and free personality who remodels one's idea of God and nature in one's own image. This humanistic ideal of personality spreads from Italy to the other countries of Europe. The new motive of freedom, in which the biblical motive of redemption and human rebirth is secularized, also incorporates from the outset the creation motive in a humanized sense. The divine creator now becomes the deified reflection of the creative impulse, which the new freedom motive calls forth in a human being. When Leibniz then calls the divine creator the great geometer, this idea of God is merely the deified reflection of the human intellect which created the infinitesimal calculus. This requires an idol of a creative intellect which can carry the mathematical analysis of the cosmos through, right into the contingent sphere of phenomena. The humanistic motive of freedom evokes the new image of macrocosmic nature, which becomes a second idol and gains mastery over the modern person. The discovery of nature in the Renaissance period signals a new religious attitude toward the cosmos surrounding an individual within the temporal horizon. Modern individuals have emancipated themselves from all faith in authority and want, in total autonomy, to take their destiny into their own hands. They seek in nature an endless field for their own drive to expand and regard it with the limitless optimism of this new vision for the future. Nature, as the macrocosmic reflection of the new ideal of the religious personality, is deified. Deus sive natura turns into a religious motive which is merely the correlate of the humanistic motive of freedom, and therefore fundamentally different from the deification of physis, nature. The latter is found in Ionic natural philosophy under the primacy of the motive of matter. Meanwhile, both in the freedom motive and in its correlate, the new motive of nature, there lurks a basic multiplicity of meanings, one that harbors many different tendencies. Born of a secularization of the biblical ground motive, the humanistic ideal of freedom lacks the depth character particular to Christian freedom, which touches the root unity of human existence. Although modern autonomous humanity has been in religious contact with the Word of God, which discloses the root of its existence, it again seeks itself within the temporal horizon and concentrates its religious impulses upon the temporal diversity of meaning of its existence. Autonomous humanity can seek its religious center in its moral, aesthetic, or emotive function, but it can also seek it in autonomous scientific thought. The same multiplicity of meanings is present in the humanistic motive of nature. Nature, in its immensity, which since the Copernican revolution in the astronomical world image seemed closely tied in with the religious revolution of the image of a human being, could be regarded as a macrocosmic reflection of a person's creative aesthetic freedom. In that case, nature is viewed as the creator of ever-new forms of beauty and centers of free individuality. At that juncture, the modern individual is not yet aware of any dialectical tension in the ground motive of nature and freedom. This is the still predominant aesthetic feature in the Renaissance's glorification of nature, which recurs in Giordano Bruno's philosophy of nature. But nature can also be viewed in terms of the Faustian motive of mastery, which permeated the humanistic ideal of personality from the beginning. In this case, autonomous science regards nature only as a gigantic object of domination, and the nature motive becomes the power motive of the modern autonomous individual. And it is this power motive which soon gains the upper hand. Galileo and Newton laid the foundations for a mathematical physics, which in fact showed the way towards scientific mastery of natural phenomena in their mathematical and physical aspects. As soon as they did this, the new philosophy, driven by the humanistic ground motive, thrust itself with religious dedication upon the new scientific method and elevated it to a universal model for thought as the foundation of the entire philosophical view of reality. The classic humanistic science ideal demanded a deterministic image of the world which, as a closed system of causalities, completely corresponded to its motive of domination. The methodological breakdown of all given structures of reality served this purpose. Hobbes, in the preface of his De Corpore, demanded this methodical destruction in the name of the creative task of logical mathematical thought. But now the dialectical tension inherent in the humanistic ground motive also becomes manifest. In the deterministic picture of nature, itself called forth by the humanistic motive of freedom, there is no room anymore for a free, autonomous individual. Nature and freedom become each other's adversaries. From this point on, humanistic thought is caught up in a restless dialectical process. The dethroning of the mathematical science ideal and Rousseau's shifting of primacy to the motive of freedom takes place in the same Enlightenment period in which Hume's psychologistic critique of knowledge undermined the foundations of modern mathematics and physics, as well as the new metaphysics based on them. In Kant's critique of knowledge, humanistic thought enters the phase of critical self-reflection. Nature and freedom are now sharply separated with the aid of the old metaphysical contrast between phenomenon and noumenon. Primacy is ascribed to the motive of freedom operative in practical reason. Nature is degraded to the level of a world of phenomena of the senses as constituted by the transcendental consciousness. Kant even refused to ascribe a divine origin to it. His idea of God becomes moralistic. God is a postulate of practical reason, and the true core of the free personality is sought in the moral, pure will. The science ideal can no longer threaten the autonomous freedom of the will, since, with the aid of the form-matter scheme, transformed in a humanistic sense, this ideal is now restricted to the realm of sensible nature. Freedom, as belonging to the supersensible realm of the ought-to-be, becomes a matter of practical faith and reason. Thus, Kant's separation of faith and science proves to be governed by the religious dialectic of the humanistic ground motive. The Restoration period ushers in the dialectical conversion of Kant's still rationalistic and individualistic concept of freedom into an irrationalistic and universalistic one. It turns from the rationalistic absolutization of law, the general rule, to the absolutization of subjective individuality and the unrepeatable one-time event in history. The historical way of thinking now arises. Born of the irrationalistic and universalistic conversion of the freedom motive, it is elevated to the status of a new universal model for thought, which leads to a historical view of reality. Simultaneously, an attempt is begun to give up Kant's critical separation of nature and freedom by means of a dialectic logic, and to think of nature and freedom as dialectically unified in a higher synthesis, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Turning against this post-Kantian idealism of freedom, positivism, Kant, cum suis, assigns primacy back to the motive of the domination of nature and regards the freedom of autonomous human nature as a natural consequence of scientific progress. The historical way of thinking is now rationalized and viewed as the highest plane of the natural scientific way of thinking. Darwinism naturalizes the historical way of thinking into an evolutionary one. Marxism transforms Hegel's dialectical idealism into dialectical historical materialism. Historicism, born of the irrationalistic conversion of the freedom motive, now distances itself from the post-Kantian idealism which had restrained it. It becomes a new science ideal which develops in dialectical tension with the humanistic ideal of personality and proves to be a far more dangerous adversary of the freedom motive than the scientific model of thought of classical determinism. It leads to a universal relativism which, though still pictured by Wilhelm Dilthey as a last step to liberate the autonomous human being from dogmatic preconceptions, nevertheless begins to affect the religious foundations of humanistic thought itself. Nietzsche already saw nihilism on the horizon as the abyss in which Western thought, under the influence of historicism, threatened to plunge itself. The emerging nihilism is also fostered by modern technocracy and its concomitant treatment of a person as part of the masses. This enslaves the free personality to the domination motive, which is detached from the central religious command of love and its relation to the root of human existence. During this process of spiritual uprooting of modern thought, overwhelmed by historicism, existentialism arises as a protest against the inner decline of the autonomous human personality. With its founder, Søren Kierkegaard, it was still completely caught up in the dialectical tension between his Christian faith and the isolated position of the autonomous individual suspended in time. The individual rebels against Hegel's dialectic because it makes him a puppet of the dialectic unfolding of the idea. But with Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger, in his famous work Sein und Zeit, and Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialism is totally humanized and becomes a final escape from the process of depersonalizing modern Western personality, which is reduced to the impersonal general human being, men. It becomes an attempt, by way of philosophical self-reflection, to restore to the humanistic freedom motive a content which it was in danger of losing under the influence of radical historicism. The existentialistic freedom motive, in dialectic opposition to the given, as the objective product of a completely devalued humanistic domination motive in science and technology, now directs itself to the existence of the ego, but in its individual historical temporalization. However, with Heidegger and Sartre, this existential freedom has no other perspective than death and nothingness. It is a transcending of being in the direction of nothingness. And in Jaspers' philosophical faith, the existential thinker admits his failure to grasp the transcendent, which in time continually conceals itself in ciphers, chiffren. The allotted amount of space prevents a more extensive discussion of the central significance of these motives for Western thought, other than the foregoing extremely limited diorama. However, one cannot warn often enough against the confusion, self-evident from the immanent standpoint, between these central ground motives and the so-called philosophical themes which naturally can be found in great diversity within one and the same philosophical system, and which are not reducible to one simple philosophical theme. The coherence of the rich diversity of philosophical themes only becomes transparent in terms of the central ground motive. The scholastic Christian side often objects strenuously to the transcendental critique of thought insofar as it proceeds from a central ground motive in the word revelation. People see in this an arbitrary selection from the great diversity of truths of faith revealed in Holy Scripture and continue to hang on to the idea that philosophy can only draw its Christian principles from the Bible via theology. A scholastic theology rightly feels threatened by a transcendental critique which exposes its dialectical ground motive, but it may not ignore the inescapable question concerning the key of knowledge, which theological exegesis cannot provide. The scholastic ground motive of nature and the supernatural removes theological thought from the radical and integral grip of the Word of God, thereby excluding the focus on the root of human existence. This also explains why people are able to see the central motive of creation, fall, and redemption only as an arbitrary selection of biblical truths of faith. The motive of nature and grace is ex origine a synthesis motive. It introduced a dialectical duality within Christian thought by alternately providing a religious point of entry for the Greek and modern humanistic ground motives. Yet people believe they could still hold on to their Christian standpoint. The three transcendental ideas. Finally, we must briefly consider how religious ground motives intrinsically permeate philosophical thought and determine its formulation of problems. This occurs by way of three transcendental theoretical ideas that lie at the basis of all philosophical thinking and make the typical philosophical view of totality possible. These ideas are directly related to the three fundamental transcendental problems which, as we saw, unavoidably arise from the intentional antithetic structure of the theoretical attitude. In the first place, every philosophy presupposes an idea of the mutual coherence and interrelation of the modalities of our horizon of experience, which are set apart in opposition to each other in the Gegenstand relation. This idea also determines the basic common denominator under which these modalities are brought in order to distinguish them theoretically from each other. Not even existentialist philosophy can escape such a transcendental idea, as shown by the fact that Heidegger, in his Sein und Zeit, expressly poses the problem of the common denominator when he tries to ontologically distinguish the given from historical being. Such a distinction is only possible in the transcendental Gegenstand relation. He poses the problem of the common denominator before accounting for the great modal diversity of the temporal horizon of human experience. This is exclusively due to the dialectical ground motive of his thinking. This ground motive preeminently requires the polar opposition between the necessity of the given and the existent freedom of human being, Dasein. Nevertheless, this ontology posits this antithesis on the basis of the theoretical logical function of thought. Even Heidegger, in his existentialistic phenomenology, is aware that the ontic is not identical with the ontological. The question how one views the interrelation and coherence of the modal aspects of our experiential horizon is in fact dependent on the starting point from which the theoretical synthesis in its intermodal character is carried out. Theoretical thought is concentrated upon this starting point by a second transcendental idea in which the deeper root unity, or in the case of a dualistic ground motive, the two supposed antagonistic roots of the separated modalities are grasped. And this second transcendental idea is itself again dependent on a third, in which theoretical thought relates the theoretical diversity and the transcendental idea of its coherence to an ultimate origin, in the case of a dialectical ground motive, to two antagonistic principles of origin. Thus, all conceivable philosophy is founded in these three transcendental ideas, which, in their indissoluble coherence, form an essential tri-unity. In the philosophy of the cosmonomic idea, this tri-unity is called the transcendental ground idea, or cosmonomic idea, as the theoretical expression of the religious law of concentration of human existence. A philosophy of the cosmonomic idea is possible only in the concentric direction of the transcendental critique of thought, in which the necessary presuppositions of the philosophical theoretical attitude are to be explicitly accounted for. Dogmatic immanence philosophy uses its cosmonomic idea implicitly without being conscious of the transcendental significance of the latter. The cosmonomic idea itself is a universally valid condition of philosophical thought, but the content given to it is dependent on the religious ground motive which governs this thought. Finally, what is the benefit of this transcendental critique of thought, here only briefly summarized, for the mutual exchange of ideas between the different schools of philosophy? The answer is that it makes genuine contact of thought possible between them, which, however paradoxical this may sound, is cut off at the root by the dogmatic standpoint of the autonomy of philosophical thought. Polarly opposed trends of thought, which belong together in their ground motive and yet repel each other, can meet with better mutual understanding once they become aware that their opposing points of view are rooted in the same central ground motive. On the other hand, schools of thought which proceed from a different ground motive can similarly begin to understand that each philosophical point of view must, in the first place, be judged in terms of its own starting point, and that fruitful philosophical dialogue can only begin when the transcendental problems of philosophical thought as such are critically accounted for. On this basis, the dialogue between the philosophy of the cosmonomic idea and neo-Thomistic philosophy has been carried on for a fairly lengthy period of time, something that has led to increasing mutual depth of insight. But every school of thought, without distinction, is a welcome partner in this critical discussion, which replaces dogmatic defensiveness with mutual critical self-reflection, and replaces the hubris of exclusivism with philosophical modesty born of insight into the relativity of all philosophical totality views. Only one who loses sight of the central point of reference and the origin of this relativity can come up with the delusion that the transcendental critique of thought must lead to a philosophical relativism. The standpoint of the philosophy of the cosmonomic idea concerning the relativity of philosophy is briefly summarized over against all relativism in its following pronouncement. Meaning is the being of all that has been created. It is religiously rooted and is of divine origin.